So, hi, that's not me. That's me. There we go. Hi, I am doing a talk today called Power and Control, and why maybe emergent narrative shouldn't be the future of game storytelling, because the original version of that tagline was why your obsession with emergent narrative sucks ass. But I was on sleeping medication when I wrote that, so it's changed now. I forgot. Yep, there we go. I did it. There we go. Oh, they appear on their own. I see. Okay, so who am I and how dare I say this thing? I am Saf. Saf, that is me. I am a narrative designer, editor, writer, podcaster, etc. I do a lot of stuff because I like doing things. And I am, at my heart, a storyteller. I have been telling stories since I was born, basically. I have my first novel still that I wrote when I was 8 years old. It is 120 written pages, and it is awful. It's so bad. And I dare because I care. I love stories, and I love storytelling a lot. So what the heck is emergent narrative, you ask? If you don't know, maybe you do. It is not authored. It is narrative that are created by the player's interactions with the game system. So, like, think of stuff like the random stuff you find in Skyrim, or like Dwarf Fortress, basically. It's stuff that isn't created or scripted. It's things that you create on your own, basically, when you play the game. Often emergent narrative isn't actually narrative. It's emergent gameplay, but it's not a narrative of any kind. It's just interesting things happening in a game. That's not really a story, and can't really be made into a story. But it's still an essential tool for game narrative. I'm putting this in here now because I will sound like I hate emergent narrative. And I don't hate emergent narrative, I just hate the way that people talk about it and the way that other kinds of game narrative is kind of pushed to the side for the sake of emergence. Okay, so what's the deal here? What am I talking about today, and why am I doing this? I've noticed a thing in discussions of emergent narrative that's like, certain demographics get really mad when asked to interact with stories that don't belong to them, aka white dudes get real mad when they play a story and it's not about them. Real mad. When I was doing research for my talk last year, actually, I found a lot of articles written by dudes who were like, emergent narrative should be the future because I want to have complete control of the story and I don't want anyone telling me what to do and I don't want to play anyone else's story. It should be my story. And that summed up a lot of what I found. And I got real mad about it. If anyone was following me on Twitter at the time, they would know that. It made me extremely mad. And then I kept finding more and more stuff about, like, from actual game developers and narrative designers and writers kind of echoing the same thing. And I hit a point where I was like, is there some kind of correlation here? What's happening? Turns out storytelling exists for a reason, and linear and authored stories have existed throughout the entire history of humanity because stories do a lot for us. The desire for fully emergent and open world games often correlates with the desire for white male power fantasies, as I kind of said before. Not always, obviously, and emergent narrative doesn't always become this, but a big push for this in technology is often from the gamer side in particular. The player wants absolute control of the story. Whether or not that's a good idea is another thing. I'm really bad at making presentations, as you've probably discovered. Surely that's a good thing. Well, I'm so good at this. As you can see, I just copy and pasted the same slide constantly. For some games, absolutely. But I'm talking about games that are trying to tell a story. And there can be emergent games that don't tell stories, and those are fun. And that's good. But if a game is trying to tell a story, or if someone wants something out of the game, there should be other aspects to it. Is restricted and inconsiderate narrative really what we want? Emergent gameplay doesn't mean emergent narrative. And let me just quickly remember what the restricted and inconsiderate narrative meant. I didn't write that down. I'm not smart sometimes. Basically, emergent narrative doesn't actually give you complete freedom a lot of the time in the games we have now, just because of technological limits and the fact it's still quite new. A lot of the time, it's kind of the same looped gameplay thing that you're just going through. Like, you're interacting with enemies and you're gathering stuff, and there's not really much else to it. But because there's so much different stuff within the game to discover in that way, it feels like it's a lot more free than it is. So it actually is extremely limiting, but you may not realize that at first. And eventually it can get extremely exhausting playing those same games over and over again, because at some point it clicks that it's not actually free. And also, many of these games don't ask us to think about what any of our choices actually mean in the greater context of the game. And when you're trying to communicate something, you need people to ask what it means. Whether or not they're doing it consciously, it's still a thing that's important. And so that's why a lot of, like, when you're making decisions in Skyrim, like, just off in the wilderness, do you think about why you're making them, or are you just kind of like, I'm going to fight that mammoth because I want to, kind of thing? Like, and it's, if it comes to, like, deeper themes, like, I don't know if Skyrim has themes. I've played it. I don't remember. I got really excited about picking flowers. But, like, do the choices make you think about that? Is what you're interacting with in the story, in the game systems, making you think about that? If you think of something like Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, the way you interact with the mechanics of that game makes you think about the story of the game, whether or not you intend to. The way that those mechanics are built makes you actively participate in the themes of the story as you're playing it. And most of all, let's see what that is. What happens to empathy? Yes, good question, me. That's not on there yet. There we go. I was seeing the preview. What happens to empathy when we play games that don't try and build an empathy, or that aren't actually about real things? They're just systems thrown at you and expecting you to come up with what you want. There's something special about games, and that is that by nature of their interactivity, games have the amazing power to encourage empathy and education through storytelling. Because they are interactive. Because you're playing a game, you are more immersed in the game than you would be otherwise. You can read a book and learn something from the book, maybe. But if you're playing a game, you're actually experiencing what you're learning. And whether or not you're planning on learning something, you may learn something anyways. It's a thing that happens. If we remove authored stories from games, we lose that power entirely. So I asked this question on Twitter the other day. What are some games that stand out to you for telling personal stories for minority folks? Does anyone here have any quick things that they would think of for this? Someone yell something. Give me something. Yes, Florence. And I got a lot of answers. I got more than this, but a lot of these were, yeah. A lot of these were games I played. A lot of them were ones I haven't played. The one I found really interesting is that Lightning Returns actually states that Lightning herself is aromantic, which is extremely cool. I didn't know that. I got things like Telltale The Walking Dead, which I didn't actually expect for some reason, but is really obvious now. There's the really lovely one of Undertale helping someone figure out that they were trans, which is just extremely cool, and I love games a lot. There were a lot more games like this. I had a lot of replies. And many of them mentioned games that were linear or branching narratives, stories that were particularly authored, which I feel like is probably an obvious thing. Games like Sibel and Virginia have defined endings, but isn't that what makes them powerful? The fact that you don't actually have control over the narrative itself. You are in this world, you're part of the story, but you don't have control over these characters. You can't change what happens in Sibel, and that's why that game is powerful, because it is telling you a story, and you become part of the story, but you're not dictating the story, and you can't. And I mean, for me, Sibel personally reflects a lot of how I felt being a young woman in, like, online gaming and chat rooms on the internet when I was younger, and the internet was still kind of new and cool. Sibel is extremely powerful for telling the story it tells and ending the way it does. And yeah, I forgot what I was going to say with that. Virginia is a game that came up a lot as well. And you can make choices in Night in the Woods and The Walking Dead, but most of the story is still extremely scripted, as you may realize if you replay any of the Telltale games. They're still really powerful stories, extremely powerful. Night in the Woods tells a really poignant story about a young woman who has a mental illness, and also spooky things are happening, and it's just extremely good. So imagine a future of games as truly emergent open world MMOs with just full choice, full autonomy, everything. And then think about how predominantly toxic and masculine the culture represented in Ready Player One is. If you've read the book, you may realize that almost every single thing referenced is written by a white dude, Basically, every single thing in that book. There's barely any woman, any people of color, nothing. I don't know what the movie's like because I refuse to watch it, but this is possibly what we're heading towards in the way we talk about storytelling. And of course, there are exceptions, as there always are when it comes to these things. While the white male power fantasy has become a troubling standard in culture, giving players true agency over their characters can give minority players freedom they can't have in the real world. But you have to build the game to support that. You have to have this consciously as a thing built into your game, otherwise it probably won't happen and it might not work. Or you'll have some real stupid, bad gender thing that you think is hilarious, and then people play it and they're like, wow, way to make me feel awful about myself. So is this really important? Yes, obviously, or else I wouldn't be talking about this. Storytelling defines so much of who we are. We are the stories we tell ourselves. We are the narratives we create for ourselves. If our games only reflect what we want, like singular we, how can we grow through this unique medium? Like, as we've seen, a lot of games, like, indie games are getting better, but like AAA still a lot of like, gruff white dads just being sad about things. And like, I have a dad. I'm not learning much from these games, honestly. Like, I've already had dad issues. I don't need to learn about it through a game already. I'm not learning much from this. But when I play games like Sabelle or Virginia, especially Virginia, like, I get a glimpse of someone else's life through an interactive medium, and I get invested in the story, and I learn through that. You can't look in a mirror and learn about the world. So, always question choices that define our collective future. It's our responsibility as storytellers. How much time do I have? Wow, I talked real quickly there. Does anyone have any questions? We're good? Thank you, Jess. Tell a joke. Any fish jokes? Oh, I don't know. The only one I have is the fish without eyes, but that's already been told today. I can't do that. No questions? I'm just gonna... Oh, wait, we got someone. I don't know much about that. Can you elaborate? Yeah, the thing is that there is a very biased lens that people view history through, and they miss that minorities did exist back then, and these people did actually exist. They're just written out of history because the people who were in power writing those histories wrote them out. And so when games like that, I actually did hear about that. I just totally forgot the name of the game because my friend was telling me about that, and everyone got extremely mad that people wanted to see representation in this because it's real. Like, people talking about with Frozen, there's like, people are like, why would anyone be black in that? It's Norway or whatever it is. They're all white, and it's like, actually, there's historical proof that they weren't all white. It's there, just people refuse to look at it, especially when they want to only see themselves in games. Yes.
How do you feel about Rust and the extension in Rust, which is otherwise a fairly standard crafting or narrative MMO, to tie characters' physical appearance, including skin color and a bunch of other stats and gender, to their Steam ID, randomize it, and then not let the player change it?
That one's a complicated one. I have mixed feelings on it. On one hand, I think it's cool to try and encourage people to play other things, but on the other hand, they can force people to play into something that they really don't want to. Like, if you force a woman who's been traumatized by a man to play as a dude who could potentially look like someone who has been in her history, like, that's bad, and you can't change what your character looks like. So on one hand, I get that they're trying to encourage empathy, but on the other hand, they're missing half of the picture there. And that's something you've always got to consider when you're building a game to do something like that. If you force players to do a particular thing that goes across all players doing something they might not want to do, you need to think about what the reasons they might not want to do that is, if that makes sense. Yes, cool. Yes?
I was talking with someone who was saying about creator agency, and if you write about what you know about, and do games that you aren't paid and stuff, that's 90% of the developers are guys.
Yes, I think so. Something I've discovered over writing for a long time is that you can put in the things you enjoy and the things about like autobiographical things, even about yourself, into something that's totally not about that. So, like, I mean, because I work as a freelancer, I often don't get a lot of creative control over the games I make, but I still find little ways to make the game something I would enjoy personally, whether it's just like throwaway lines in dialogue or like adding in a little crafting thing that I enjoy. I mean, when you actually have creative control at a big company or something like that, and you want to make a game you enjoy, I feel like doing that, but also then reaching out to other communities that may be players you want to include and asking them what they would also want. So you can have both, possibly. Like, learn to weave together what you want and what is good for other people and not just making the same game over and over again. Another way to do that is also just make personal projects or work with other people outside of the big studios, possibly. I mean, you don't have much free time when you're making games, but still. But yeah, there's a lot more ways to actually integrate what you want and what your personal knowledge is, like writing what you know and putting that into something you don't actually know. But because you have that personality that you have personally, that was bad, it adds some more realism to it anyways. And then also, of course, if you're writing about other minorities, talk to them. But yeah, I think like the problem is that we do largely have like a white male game developer thing, especially in like writing and stuff. It's kind of a problem. And I think part of it there is also for people who work in those areas who have power to try and hire more diverse groups. I saw a really good talk at GDC by Zach Barris, I think his name was, who worked on Life is Strange Before the Storm, and he did a really good talk about building a diverse writer's room. And he talked about it in a way that was like, it's just something you should do. Like, you should think about it actively and build this. And because of that, his writer's room was extremely diverse, and that diversity came through in the story itself. Yeah. Yes, Ken?
Thanks for that talk. I think you touched on many facets of sort of narrative and generative tension. I was wondering, it seems to me like a lot of the problems that you're highlighting with procedural or generative narrative actually stem from the tropes of RPGs themselves, where they tend to model very sort of masculine and very sort of colonialist mechanics of like conquering and looting and combat. And I was wondering if maybe if that's more of a problem, and actually if you just change up some of those verbs, because you asked the question like, where is the empathy? And could you create procedural narrative and be more inclusive if you focus more on empathy and more on emotions and relationships?
Yes, I absolutely think so. A large part of this talk is the idea of emergent narrative as the future of storytelling. You're absolutely right that a lot of the problems stem from like original, very masculine RPG stuff, as you can see with like pretty much any like XCOM itself is extremely military and like blokey, and dudes love it because it's challenging and really hard and not easy at all. And like the games are good, but they're not the future of storytelling in any way whatsoever. Something I played Pyre by Supergiant Games last year, and that game, surprisingly emergent. The narrative is like scripted at times. I think there's randomization. I really want to talk to them at some point about it because I'm really curious. But it's got branches, but I was playing it at the same time as a friend, and we were talking about it, and we would make the smallest choices, and our entire game just completely changed from each other. Like, we missed conversations that the other person got, and because of my choices I made, and because there's no lose condition in that game, you continue playing even if you lose the fantasy soccer, basically. You can keep going, and your story changes because of that. And because of that, I ended up creating an entire emotional arc, personally for myself, that my friend absolutely didn't have because of just the way I'd made choices in the game. And it was built entirely through, like, it wouldn't have been a planned scripted arc. Nobody could have known that I would have loved the character I loved and then gotten there attached and then made the choices I made so that she had an entire arc throughout the entire story. That couldn't have been planned for. But the way that game was written, it's got a very diverse cast as well. The way it was written did inspire empathy in me towards these characters and the plight that they were in. And so it is entirely possible to build emergent stories that have empathy built into them and have interesting, diverse characters and don't just rely on you becoming the ultimate power of the story or whatever. It just has to be considered in a different way. Yes?
Do you think games that are, like, from the start setting out to create emergent narratives and games that are setting out to create pre-crafted
I think every type of narrative does have things to learn from the others. I think emergent narrative is a very good tool and can be used extremely well in a lot of circumstances. Like, if it doesn't have to be the main narrative tool in your game or the main framework. It can be just things that you add in, like Empire. I don't think they were intended that to be an emergent narrative of any kind, but it just is there because of how they built the story. And I think looking at how you can build systems so that players can interact them within your linear or scripted or branching story, so that they can get a bit more of their own story back from it as well, and a bit more like actual responsive interaction, is an extremely good thing to do. On the other hand, I think, yeah, emergent narratives, if they want a story to come across to the player, and especially because emergent stories are fun. Like, you go on Skyrim, you're like, yeah, I fought this dragon, and then I found Lydia, and she was dead in her underwear, and I don't know why, which is what happened to me. Also, the dragon was like bright red. I think I broke that game. Like, that's a funny story to me, but if I try and tell it to some random person I just met in a bar, they're just like, what the hell is wrong with you? But if I talk about, like, The Last of Us, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that one bit made me cry a lot, and I'll meet someone else and be like, yeah, I cried a lot. And it's a universal story because you all get the same story. And so when it comes to emergent narratives themselves, like, building something that players can enjoy for themselves and have that one little story for themselves is good. But if you want them to have a more emotional connection to your game, or to think about it for longer than just that, in some form, looking at how themes or characterizations or anything from, like, branching games can be brought into that is always a good thing to do. Especially themes. I'm a big fan of themes. Always think about themes for your games, please. It's good. Yes?
Do you think emergent narrative is close to passing the Turing test for you as a writer?
No, I don't think so. I think it has quite a way to go there, just because there's a lot to do to make it actually, like, really get there. And I also have a habit of replaying games over and over again and trying every possible thing, so I do start to pick out when things do that. But I know not everyone does that. It's getting very good, but I don't think it's quite there.
What was that question?
If I think as a writer whether or not emergent narrative is passing the Turing test. Yeah. Are we done? Are we good? Yay, I can't believe I actually got through that a lot faster than I planned. I'm usually like 10 minutes over the limit, so I'm doing good. It was lovely talking to you all. Thank you for listening to my talk. I hope I made you think about empathy a bit more.